Alrighty, everyone. I hope you are having a great start to your Friday, almost the weekend. Just a couple of things. I unfortunately am at the California High School State Speech and Debate Tournament, so I am unable to be there in person today. So you will be getting this video lecture. Couple of important things and reminders. Number one, for class today, we are going to start off with the article that you read for class that we did not get through. So please have this article out. It's the Strikers, Scabs, and Sugarmongers. Again, Strikers, Scabs, and Sugarmongers. If you were absent or did not or left your copy at home, come up to the teacher's desk. There should be extra ones that you can take. So again, Strikers, Scabs, and Sugarmongers, you will need this article that we read from last class. We'll start with that today. Second important announcement. This video recording will be uploaded into files onto Canvas. You will be able to see it and refer back to it. If we did not, or if you do not, your class does not get through this video, please make sure that you go home and watch the rest of it. We will be reviewing this in class, but we will not be re-lecturing on it. Okay, so please make sure that you watch this video on files if we don't get through it, the entirety of it in class. Next, your homework week 17, homework week number 17, that is due on May 5th, which is Monday. Please make sure that you submit that and turn that in. And last but not least, your Irish, Jewish, and Chinese immigrants in-class essay and quiz are going to be on May 6th, which is a Tuesday. The study guide is already up in Files, Unit 2. Again, Files, Unit 2, you can see the study guide there. Again, practice those active methods of studying. Come up with questions or prompts that you can answer and practice writing thesis statements and analyzing cartoons, right? So practice those active methods of studying. Alrighty, gentlemen, let's jump right in. So last class, we finished up our chapter on Chinese immigrants and began our chapter on Japanese immigrants. What I want you to do now is I want you to take 30 seconds, turn to your elbow partner, just very briefly discuss. What is one reason why Japanese immigrants moved over to the United States? What's one reason Japanese immigrants moved over to the US? Take 30 seconds, go ahead and discuss that question. Sub, if you would just pause this video for 30 seconds. Hopefully, all of you had a very fruitful discussion. Remember that many of the Japanese people who end up moving over to the United States were moving over because of reasons like poverty, right? During this time, the Meiji Restoration, which restores the emperor and gets rid of the feudal system in Japan, restores the emperor to his sort of full power, right? And destroys the feudal system. That led to a bunch of taxation, right? Emperor Mutsuhito wants to militarize, and as a result, that ends up leaving many of the peasants unable to pay their taxes. And because of this, many of them move over to the United States seeking for new opportunities, right? There's an emigration netsu, an emigration fever moving out of Japan and to the United States, specifically, right, to Hawaii. Now, I want you to take 30 more seconds and I want you to turn to your elbow partner. And last class, we talked a lot about Japanese women, right? What I want you to do is I want you to take 30 seconds and discuss how are Japanese women viewed differently than Chinese women? How are Japanese women viewed differently than Chinese women? And how does that allow them to come into the United States? There's a specific method they use. So again, two questions. How are Japanese women different from Chinese women? How do Japanese women come into the United States? Take 30 seconds to discuss. Sub, if you just pause this video very briefly. Again, hope you had a very fruitful discussion. Remember that for Japanese women, right, they were viewed as proper and pristine. This was a big contrast, right, from Chinese women who were often viewed as prostitutes, as hookers, as dirty, devious people, right? And as a result, the Japanese government really wanted to make sure that Japanese women had good connotations, right, associated with them. They wanted to make sure that the U.S. government did not view Japanese women like they did Chinese women. And so as a result, right, many of the government decided to control who got to come in and which Japanese women got to move over to Hawaii. And we see Japanese women using picture brides, right? Pictures of themselves that their husbands would bring over to the US first to enter the country, right? Their husband would come into the United States. They would proudly claim that, hey, this is a picture, right? This is a picture of my wife, right? This is a picture of my wife. And as a result, right, you need to let her into this country, right? This is my wife. You need to let her in, right? So these picture brides were a way for Japanese men who came over initially to get their wives over here to the US as well. Now, gentlemen, what I want us to do now is I want us to transition into the article. Now, again, we started this article last class. We did not finish it. So this is what I would like you to do. I would like you to go ahead and continue reading the article from where you left off. So whatever that happens to be, wherever you left off, right? Continue reading. And as you are reading, I want you to underline evidence that proves this thesis statement on the board. To increase profits on sugar plantations, bosses exploited Japanese workers by paying them unfairly, forcing them to work long hours, and providing terrible housing conditions. So again, as you read, underline evidence that proves this thesis statement. Once you are done reading, I want you to turn to the back of the article, right? There's a blank page on the back. Okay? I want you to choose one piece of evidence, any evidence you want, but one piece of evidence. And I want you very briefly to explain, to analyze a piece of evidence and explain why it's so important in answering the thesis that you see on the screen. So again, choose one piece of evidence, explain why it's so important in answering this thesis on the screen. Okay. Gentlemen, you have 8.5 minutes remaining. Go ahead and get reading and underlining, and go ahead afterwards, after you're done reading, get analyzing. Sub, if you could just pause this video here and let the kids work for about 8.5 minutes. Alrighty, everyone. I hope you had the ability to analyze a piece of evidence. What I want you to do now is I want you to spend 1 minute to turn to your elbow partner, tell them which piece of evidence did you choose, and how did that piece of evidence prove the thesis statement? So again, take 1 minute, turn to your elbow partner, discuss what piece of evidence did you choose, how did that prove the thesis statement? Go ahead and take 1 minute. Sub, if you could just pause this video for a minute. Alrighty, I hope you had a good discussion with your elbow partners. At this point, we're going to transition to our notebooks. So go ahead and take 10 seconds and transition to your notebooks. Alrighty, transitioning in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Alrighty, gentlemen, I want to take a couple minutes and just talk a little bit about what you read in that article, right? Now, as you know, Japanese workers were not treated particularly well when it came to their work on the sugar plantations in Hawaii. One of the big things that we see on these sugar plantations is that many of the plantation owners would hire diverse workforces as a means to pit ethnicities against each other. And this was to stop people from striking, right? Now, you can imagine, right? If you have Japanese workers and Filipino workers and Puerto Rican workers and Portuguese workers, right? If none of them are able to speak the same language, it's very difficult for these workers to come up and unite, right, as one force to strike against these sugar plantation owners, right? And so the whole point of hiring these diverse workers was to really pit these workers against each other. Now, in addition to that, we also see that many of those who were white, right, those who were Portuguese workers, right, were Anglo-American workers, worked as the supervisors or worked as lunas, right? Many of those who were of Asian descent, Korean workers, Japanese workers, Filipino workers, those three ethnic groups were laborers. They were the ones doing the hard work instead of ones supervising the work. And so, as you can sort of see here, right, for a lot of these Asian workers, many of them, right, had to labor in these hot fields in incredibly humid weather, right? Now, the workday was literally 12-hour days. You would start at 5 a.m. 5 a.m. is when you would start hana hana. Hana hana means work. And you would work until 4:30. Pretty much, gentlemen, you would only get half an hour for a lunch break, right? Maybe some 5-minute bathroom breaks in between. I just want you to think about how difficult that is, right? You're literally taking a machete every single day and you are walking into a sugarcane plantation field and you are whacking down that sugarcane. And sugarcane is really tall and segmented. As you can see in these photos, right? The sugarcane is super tall. It's super thick to cut. And so you really have to use force, right, to really cut that sugarcane down. It is not easy work. And you would often work in gangs of workers. This is very similar, right, to the sort of task system that Jewish immigrants would work in the factory. So one person would be responsible for hoeing up or cutting down the sugarcane, right, or harvesting the sugarcane. One person would be responsible for stripping all the leaves from the sugarcane. Another person would take that sugarcane and they would sort of squeeze out all of the juice, right? They would level the sugarcane out. They would squeeze out all of the juice from the sugarcane. Someone else would take that liquid and then pour it on some sort of sheet, right, for it to dry out and turn into sugar, right? So each person had a specific task that they needed to do. In addition, right, women were often paid less than men, right? So women did not have very good wages in this situation, right? And most even disgustingly, right? Many of the workers who were living on sugar plantations lived in unsanitary and crowded barracks, right? These places were housing units that were like 50 feet long, right? So, think about, like two low-K classrooms, like back to back, if not like a little more than two, right? This like 50-foot building, this house that nearly, right, 50 people would be living in, right? There was one hallway, right, that separated rooms from each other. These rooms were chock full of workers. They often had a single futon mattress, right? And you would sleep there. No space really to store any of these belongings. Now, one of the worst parts of this was how unsanitary it was. Now, 50 people in one house, already disgusting, right? But the worst part about all of this is that there was actually a hierarchy of where people lived. Those who were Anglo Americans, those who were plantation bosses, often lived at the top of a hill, right? So oftentimes these workers would be living in on a hill, right? Those who were Anglo Americans, those who were white plantation owners, those sugar plantation owners, they would live at the top of the hill. And as you went down the hill, right, you would see a difference in the sort of level of superiority, right? So at the top was a plantation owner, and then like sort of in the middle, you'd have the lunas or the supervisors, right? And then at the very bottom of a hill lived those who were laborers, the workers, the people actually harvesting the sugarcane. Again, many of those being Korean, Filipino, and in this case, Japanese laborers. And the most disgusting part, gentlemen, was all about the sewage. As you know, sewage flows down, liquids flow down. And so, as people would sort of use the toilet or use the bathroom, all of that disgusting, pee, feces, right, crap would literally be flowing down the hill and would sort of, you know, amass, right, where those who are Japanese, Filipino, and Korean would work, right, would live, right? And so all of this crap comes flowing down this hill. And so literally, right, these Japanese, Filipino, Korean workers are living in their own crap, in their own filth, right? And the filth of everyone else who's living above them on that hill, right? So these barracks are crowded. They're incredibly, incredibly disgusting and unsanitary. Now, I want to take a second and talk a little bit about resistance, right? We talked and learned a little bit about how all of the things that these plantation bosses would do, right, to these laborers. But what about ways that they resisted? right? What are some ways in which they fought back, right? Well, let's talk a little bit about labor unions or blood unions. So in 1909, Japanese workers and other workers of different ethnicities worked together. They worked together to form blood unions. Blood unions are also another name for labor unions. So blood unions, labor unions, same thing. And these blood unions were very much supported by their community. When Japanese workers would go on strike, when they would refuse to work, right, because these wages are so poor, because the living conditions in the barracks were so crappy, right, because of the fact that they weren't getting paid well, right, their communities supported them and really pushed their workers to continue striking. So, for example, the Honolulu Retail Merchants Association gave to a general strike fund to make sure that those who did not have enough food, right, could get some money from this general strike fund and use that to buy foods and meals for themselves while their husbands or wives struck, right? The Japanese Physicians Association was another example of how the community supported Japanese striking workers, right? This Physicians Association gave free healthcare and medical services to anyone who was striking, right? So if you were hurt, right, while you were working and leveling sugarcane, the Japanese Physicians Association gave free medical services to you because you were striking. Now, I want to take a second and really examine, right, these labor unions for a second. We learned a little bit about Jewish and Irish labor unions, right? But in this case, we're talking about a non-white ethnic group, Japanese people, striking. I want you to take 30 seconds, turn to your elbow partner, and discuss how does striking make one more American? How does striking make one more American? Sub, if you would just pause this video for 30 seconds as the students discuss. So, folks, remember that striking was a means to, make one more American. Because what's more American than fighting for your rights, right? Fighting against inequality, fighting for more freedoms, right? Rather than being, pushed down by these oppressive plantation bosses, right? And so, for many of the Japanese, they saw striking as a means to fight for one's equality, right? Means to fight for freedom, right? Making them uniquely more American. But here's the deal. It wasn't just the Japanese striking alone. Oftentimes, gentlemen, Filipino workers who worked in the same fields as Japanese workers struck together. In 1919, Filipino workers actually struck first. And during the strike, the 1919 strike, Filipino workers, they demanded higher wages, an 8-hour workday, no more 12-hour shifts, 8 hours only, right? An insurance fund, as well as paid maternity leave. So if a wife got pregnant, if a woman got pregnant while she was working, right, they would be able to take that time off, right? And they asked these Japanese workers to join them. Hey, do you want to join us and fight for better wages and earn a shorter workday? If that's what you want, come and join our labor union. Now, here's the deal. Many of those Japanese workers agreed. And what we saw was an inter-ethnic labor union, one of the first labor unions that combined people of two different ethnicities. We actually talked a little bit about this when we talked about Mexican workers, right? Japanese Mexican Labor Association, Japanese Mexican workers in California came together to strike for higher wages on beet farms, right? In this case, in Hawaii, we see Japanese workers under the Japanese Federation of Labor, or JFL, the Japanese Federation of Labor, JFL, and Filipino workers under the FFL, or Filipino Federation of Labor, FFL, Filipino Federation of Labor. Both of those groups come together and they form an inter-ethnic labor union. They form the Hawaii Laborers Association, the Hawaii Laborers Association, or HLA. Now, as you know, many of the plantation bosses, they really tried to, use divisive tactics as a means to separate these different ethnic groups, right? They tried to divide and control all of these groups. In fact, one of the plantation bosses, they actually went to the FFL. They went to the leader of the FFL, Pablo Manlapit, And basically, what they tried to do was they tried to bribe him. Like, hey, call off the strike, call off the strike. You'll get some more money, right? You can call off the strike, and you'll be a little richer, right? We'll pay you a little bit more, right? Even though Manlapit ends up actually calling off the strike because of that bribe, Japanese workers end up fighting back. They continue to strike. Filipino workers continue to strike, even though Manlapit calls off the strike in the first place. Unfortunately, in the 1919 strike, the bosses were able to hire different scabs, Portuguese, Korean, as well as Hawaiian scabs to replace these Filipino and Japanese workers who struck. Many of those who were Filipino and Japanese were also evicted from their homes. So in 1919, they unfortunately did not have a very successful strike. But nonetheless, there were partial victories to be had. In fact, the plantation bosses were so scared, were so fearful of another strike happening. What they ended up doing was they increased wages by 50%. They increased wages by 50%, and they were forced to cut back on the number of hours that workers would work. So even though many of the Filipino and Japanese workers got fired or were replaced by scabs, these workers were still able to secure an increase in wages and a decrease in hours, right? So even though they were unsuccessful at the end of the day, right, they managed to get some concessions out of these plantation owners, making this one of the very first sort of successful, right, labor unions and sort of successful movements in Hawaii in the first place, even though it was sort of discreet, right? So even though they were unsuccessful initially, right, these partial victories, right, really lend themselves to really helping these plantation workers. Now, gentlemen, as these Japanese workers were working in the fields, we start to see Japanese culture begin to, be shared amongst these different workers, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to play a little game. I know even though I'm not in person, right? What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to take a little pause in between these pictures that I show you. And in between the pauses, what I want you to do is I want you to shout out what is in the picture, right? Okay, if you recognize anything, you see anything in the picture, right? Just shout it out, right? All of these pictures have to do with some sort of Japanese culture, okay? So some sort of Japanese culture, some pictures are going to show up. Go ahead during the little second or two that I pause, shout out loud, right, what these things are, right? So our first picture is this. If you guess bonsai tree, you are correct, right? So this is a bonsai tree. This is found in many Japanese gardens. In fact, Mr. Urhausen in ARC is actually really, really good at cultivating bonsai trees. So if you want to ask him about, how he does it, feel free to do that and check him out in ARC, right? But bonsai trees, the smaller you can get it, the more impressive it is, right? Because to sort of keep a tree that small, it takes a lot of skill, right? So this is a form of sort of artistic gardening that many of the Japanese people bring over to the United States. Our second picture is this. If you guess that this is koi, you'd be correct. So koi is the national fish of Japan, right? They're incredibly, incredibly beautiful. You can find them in these ponds all over Japan. And you can sort of see here, right? This koi in particular has a red circle on top of their head, right? Very much symbolizing Nihon, right? This sort of land of the rising sun, right? Next picture. If you guessed that this was a furrow, you'd be correct. A furrow is a traditional communal bath. So people would come here after work, after, stripping down all the leaves in the sugar cane and squeezing all the juice out, right? Leveling the sugar cane. They would come here and they would take these big buckets and they would sort of sit in this tub, sit in this wooden tub, and they would take the buckets and sort of pour water on themselves as a means to just relax after a long day of work. Right, so this is a furrow. This is a traditional Japanese bath. Our next photo is as follows. If you guessed that this was a Japanese garden, you would be correct, right? So this shows a Shinto temple This temple is actually located in Honolulu, Hawaii. You can see the Japanese pond or a pond here filled with koi, right? It's a little hard to see in the picture, but I'm sure that there's koi here, right? And many Japanese people would come here as a means to sort of pray, right? They would sort of go into the temple, they would worship their ancestors, they would pray to the gods, right, for better fortunes, right? And so this was a means for them to sort of ground themselves as they were working in the sugarcane plantations. Our next photo is as follows. If you guessed that this was Obon, you would be correct. So, gentlemen, this is Obon. This is it's a traditional festival for souls. It happens usually in July of each year. And this is a time where kids, parents, and anyone and the relatives would dress up in kimono, right? Traditional Japanese garments like this, right? You can see this pretty kimono here with some flowers on it. And they would dress up in traditional Japanese wear, and what they would do is they would sort of honor their ancestors, right? They would thank the ancestors and their grandparents for being here, right? Thank you and thank their ancestors for giving them so much wisdom, right? So this was a festival where people could honor their ancestors. We'll have two photos that show up, one on the upper sort of left-hand corner, one on the lower right. What are these two images? We'll start on the image on the bottom, right? This is sumo wrestling, right? Sumo wrestling, as you many know, is the national sport of Japan, right? These are when two sort of large sumo wrestlers they try to push themselves, push the other person, excuse me, out of a ring, right? And they would sort of use their brute strength or brute force as a means to sort of win the match, right? On the upper left-hand corner, we see taiko drumming. Taiko drumming is a specific type of drumming in Japan. Super cool. When I was a student at UC Berkeley, they would have taiko drum performances in our sort of quad or in Sproul Plaza. Super, super cool, right? They often use these small little sticks to hit these large, large drums. So it takes a lot of skill and a lot of practice. We have three photos that show up next. What are these three photos? I'm going to start with the most obvious one here, this one right here on the bottom of the screen. This is sushi, right? It is delicious, right? Delicious. It's really, really yummy to eat, right? It's raw fish over rice, right? Or seafood over rice. You can see here octopus, nigiri. You can see here shrimp, as well as some tuna, as well as some rolls, right? So this is the food that Japanese people would eat during lunch breaks, right? We also have in the middle of the screen here daikon. Daikon is a type of radish, Asian radish, that oftentimes is either pickled or tossed into soups. It is very, very delicious. It's very neutral tasting, so it soaks up a lot of the flavor. Really, really good and delicious. This last one here is called ume. Ume is pickled plum. It's pickled plum. It's also very good, especially in on top of rice, right? Oftentimes, a pickled plum is put into some onigiri, which is this sort of like rice ball. Really, really delicious. This sort of slight, sort of sour-ish, but also sweetish flavor that gets brought out by the pickling, right? So, gentlemen, all of these three foods, ume, daikon, and sushi, are super important because these foods are foods that the Japanese workers would eat during their lunch breaks. And it's not just, food that they would eat during their lunch breaks. It's actually food that they would share with other workers, right? So Japanese workers worked alongside Portuguese workers, alongside Puerto Rican workers, alongside Filipino workers, right? Alongside Korean workers, right? And some Chinese workers as well. And what these workers would do to sort of build up a rapport, to build up, camaraderie with each other, is they would share their foods, right? So a Japanese person might be bringing sushi for their meal, right? And they would give some pieces of sushi to a Japanese sorry, a Filipino person, or a Chinese person, or a Portuguese person. And the other person would eat the food and realize, oh my gosh, this is delicious. This is absolutely amazing, right? And then the other person would share some food in return, right? So a Korean person might share some kimchi, right? A Portuguese person might have some tarts, right? Or some fruit that they had at home. And so people began to share all these foods with each other and really began to grow this sense of community, right? Which is super important, especially when it comes to striking, right? People can't strike unless they trust each other, right? And so these workers began to really sow these seeds of trust, right? Really began to learn how to trust one another through food. Now, one other way that workers began to sort of work with each other and build up rapport is actually by creating a completely new language. A completely new language. This language, gentlemen, was called Pidgin. Was called Pidgin, not the bird, but spelled a little differently. Pidgin, Pidgin. Okay. What I want us to do is I want us to watch this video. And as you're watching this video on Pidgin, what I want you to do is I want you to answer these two questions. First, how was Pidgin created? How was Pidgin created? And second, what languages does it borrow from? How was Pidgin created? And what languages does it borrow from? How was Pidgin created? What languages does it borrow from? Alrighty, let's take a listen.
Oh, you know what, Dave, you go on boat, all right? John, you go on boat. Go on. Time you go 2, they're on 3. You guys go this side. The same like the other day, man. Go about 3 times, but when you're coming down sprint sometimes, then lengthen out.
So, Jay, let me read them?
I go read them.
Tell
Just
him
the same.
second time.
People think Pidgin one language. Yeah, that's my language. That's the language of my heart. Maybe I don't use them every day because I don't see people who only speak Pidgin, so I just speak to them or talk to them in standard English. But if somebody talk like this to me, well, I mean, just come natural for talk. I guess because it was from small kid time. That's how I was talking. It's the language of Hawaii. I mean, I don't want to say the Hawaiian language not important. That's the indigenous people's language, and that's great. But the Hawaii we know today, for all the immigrants that went come from all over the place, Japan, Philippines, China, Portugal, and come together, that's the language.
Yet people ask, what's Pidgin? Pidgin one language we talk in Hawaii. More than half the people here. Different from Hawaiian. Maybe a little bit like English, but get all kinds of stuff from other kind of languages mixed in. Like from Hawaiian, Cantonese, Portuguese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino. You know, other people when work the plantations.
At the time when they started the plantations in Hawaii, the power on the plantations were primarily English speakers. The immigrant groups do not know each other's language. They're different languages. So in order to communicate with each other, they are using English or whatever English they can hear.
So let's say a Japanese immigrant and a Portuguese immigrant trying to speak English to each other, but throwing in features from their own first languages as well. That's how Pidgin start.
One of the interesting features about Pidgin, it has to get vocabulary from somewhere. So one of the things it does is it borrows a lot of vocabulary from the languages around it. I can sort of hear my grandmother saying stuff. It's something like, you raiki banana, you wiki wiki kau kau mai tai. The meaning of that, you raiki banana, if you want this banana, You wiki wiki cow cow. You quickly eat it, Mai Tai, it'll be okay.
What about the manapua? Oh, manapua, chashu? Yes.
The word manapua, which have been reported to have come from mea ono pua'a. Okay, so mea thing, ono, delicious, pua'a, pig. Right, so delicious pig thing, right? So manapuas are those buns that have the pork inside of them, and I can imagine. I mean, I don't know exactly when it started or what happened, but I can imagine someone, Hawaiian coming up and asking a Chinese guy, give me the delicious pig thing, So mea ono pua'a, and then mea ono pua'a then becomes manapua.
Oh, now you have roast pork. Roast pork too. Roast pork, I like one too. And roast duck.
So who we are, all that we think and do on this island, all that stuff that make Hawaiian culture is kind of captured in the language.
So, gentlemen, as you can see here, right, Pidgin is this language that was created because of these workers working on the sugarcane plantations, right? They come together, they try to speak English, right? And it comes out in this sort of broken, but also, so like unique English culture, right? This sort of Creole language that combines aspects like Cantonese, Portuguese, Japanese, Korean, Hawaiian, right? All into one cohesive language that everyone can understand. Now, gentlemen, I want to take a second and I want to transition into talking a little bit about assimilation. And to do that, I want us to talk a little bit about one important Japanese figure, especially when it came to the United States and the mainland. So we're going to move from Hawaii to California. And I want to talk a little bit, gentlemen, about Kyotaro Abiko. Kyotaro Abiko. Now, here's the thing about Abiko. Abiko was a young Japanese immigrant who leaves Japan, comes over to the United States, and settles in San Francisco. He comes to SF, and he works a whole bunch of jobs, right? He's a student at UC Berkeley. He does, jobs like delivering newspapers, helping at restaurants, working in laundry, becoming a writer for a local journalist in a newspaper, right? And Kyotaro Abiko, he ends up, as one of his final jobs, he ends up as an agricultural contractor. He works on farms. And he realizes one important thing. He realizes that it's important for families, especially Japanese families, to settle in the United States. And gentlemen, Abiko's argument was as follows. If we settle in the United States, if we start to establish roots here, that will mean that Americans might finally begin to accept us, right? Creating roots here, assimilating here, starting families here. Maybe Americans will take a look at that and realize, hey, Japanese people aren't just people that are just going from place to place and not staying in or learning a specific place's culture, right? We begin to establish roots here. Maybe finally Americans will see them, Anglo-Americans will see Japanese people as part of America. And so Abiko ends up creating the Yamato colony. Gentlemen, the Yamato colony is located in the San Joaquin Valley, right? This is the county right next to Alameda County. So if you're driving up to Sacramento, right, you actually pass by San Joaquin, right, San Joaquin County, right? So the Yamato colony is located in San Joaquin, the San Joaquin Valley. It's a super fertile region where many people are planting their crops, right? And so Japanese farmers go into these regions and they begin to plant, hay, alfalfa. They start planting grapes, fruit trees like cherry orchards and peach trees, right? And they're incredibly successful. They manage to sell these crops and make more money. But the problem is just like the Jewish immigrants, right, who start becoming more successful, right, and begin to flaunt their wealth. Just like how Jewish people began to to experience more anti-Semitism as they are increasingly more successful, so too do the Japanese. The Japanese face incredible backlash with the alien land law. Now, gentlemen, the alien land law said that anyone who was not a US citizen, anyone who was not a US citizen could not own land in the United States. I'll say that one more time. Anyone who is not a US citizen could not own land in the United States. So anyone not a US citizen could not own land in the US. Right? Now there's a catch, right? Just like the foreign miners tax, right, which said that no non-citizen could mine without having to pay a fee, right? And the catch was that Japanese, Mexican people, Chinese and Mexican people could not become citizens in the first place. Japanese people couldn't become citizens either, right? So again, the alien land law, right, is a law that bans non-citizens, including the Japanese, who could not become US citizens, from owning land in the first place. And eventually, gentlemen, Abiko is forced to sell their land, sell his land, sell the Yamato colony, and is no longer able to own any more land in the United States because he is Japanese. Now, gentlemen, there's a Supreme Court case that deals with citizenship, specifically with Japanese citizenship. And that Supreme Court case, gentlemen, is called Ozawa versus US. Ozawa versus US. We're going to watch this quick 1-minute video. As you're watching, what I want you to do is I want you to write down, what is the precedent? What is the rule that the Supreme Court of the United States sets in Ozawa versus US? Right? How does the Supreme Court rule in this super important case? Alrighty, gentlemen, let's take a listen. How does the Supreme Court rule in this case?
Ozawa's from Japan. He comes to the United States. He makes the claim that he's white and therefore he should be a citizen based on his skin color. And he says to the court, you know, if you look under, you know, my arm, under my shirt, like my skin is lighter than so many of these other European people's. You know, I am white. Furthermore, I have learned English. I have taught my children English. I go to a church. I think he attended Berkeley. You know, he's just saying, I am a patriot. Make me an American. And he's pointing out his skin color as a way of becoming white. So the Supreme Court comes back to this and says, only Caucasians are white, and you, Ozawa, are not a Caucasian. Therefore, you are not white. And they deny him citizenship based on that.
So, gentlemen, in Ozawa versus US, right, Takao Ozawa comes over as a Japanese person, right, and says that, hey, I want US citizenship. In fact, when Ozawa was here in the United States, he ends up going to school here, right? So he attends high school here. He comes over and also attends college here, right? So he actually goes to UC Berkeley. He settles in the United States and begins and starts a family, right? In fact, when he starts a family, right, he starts also attending mass. He goes to church, right? His sons attend American schools. In fact, Ozawa never spoke Japanese at home. He only spoke to his sons in English, trying to get them to assimilate, right, into the United States and into American culture, right? He also works in Honolulu and in the United States and in California, right? He works for an American company. He's incredibly loyal to them. And when he goes to apply for US citizenship, right, the courts say no. He doesn't get it, right? And the court rules that even though he, you know, knows English and speaks English fluently, even though he goes to church every Sunday, even though his sons attend an American school and are also fluent in English, Ozawa can't become a citizen. Why? Because the Supreme Court says that only if you are Caucasian, doesn't matter if your skin is actually white, right? Doesn't matter your skin color. If you want to be a US citizen, you have to be Caucasian, right? Now, gentlemen, I wish I had a map closer to sort of point to, but the term Caucasian comes from the Caucasus Mountains, right? And the Caucasus Mountains are sort of this mountainous border range, right? Borders sort of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Russia to the north, right? Splits down into Turkey, right? And so in this sort of scenario, right, the argument that the Supreme Court makes is that unless you come from that specific region, right, you are not allowed to become a US citizen, right? And so unfortunately, Ozawa, despite doing all of the right things, right, can't be a US citizen in the first place. Now, oftentimes, gentlemen, Japanese citizens were found sort of stuck in the middle. They couldn't become US citizens, right? But they came over from Japan to the United States seeking to find a new home. And so many of them, gentlemen, often felt stuck in the middle. Those who were struggling to assimilate often had said this sort of quotation, right? We try hard to be American, but Americans always say you always Japanese. Irish become American and all the time talk about Ireland. Italians become Americans, even if do all time like in Italy. So, in other words, live in Italy, right? But Japanese can never be anything but Jap. Gentlemen, I want you to take 30 seconds. I want you to turn to your elbow partner, just briefly discuss. What does this quotation mean? What's the speaker trying to say? Take 30 seconds. Go ahead and discuss with your elbow partner. Sub, if you can just pause this here. Gentlemen, I want to return back to our discussion about whiteness, right? Those who are Irish, right, even though they weren't considered Anglo-American or weren't considered white, right, become accepted into American society because of their skin color. We don't have the time, unfortunately, to talk about Italian Americans or Italians who immigrated over to the United States. But very similarly, many of them were compared to apes or animals, right? They were seen as uncivilized. But yet, due to their skin color, become accepted into the United States. But here's the thing. Japanese citizens, Japanese people who come over to the United States, they're not white. And so, even though they try so hard to assimilate, they try to speak English, they attend good education, they go to good schools, Japanese person can never be anything but Japanese. In the last couple minutes of class, I want to take a second to talk a little bit about assimilation. Now, there are two generations of Japanese immigrants. First, the Issei, and second, the Nisei. So the Issei are Japanese immigrants who come over but were born in Japan, right? The first generation of Japanese immigrants, the Issei. The Nisei, on the other hand, right, are the Japanese people born to Japanese parents in the United States. So these are Japanese Americans. They're Japanese people born in the United States on US soil, making them US citizens, right? Issei not US citizens, Nisei born here and thus automatic citizens. Now, if you speak Japanese, it will be easy to remember, right? Ichi, ni, san, 1, 2, 3. Ichi, ni, san, right? So Issei and Nisei, the first and second generations. Now, remember, many of the Nisei, the second generation of Japanese immigrants, very much felt stuck in between, right? They didn't look American, right? They were Japanese. They were Asian, right? They didn't look American, but yet they knew nothing about Japan, right? And so many of our family members, right, began to expose them, right? The Issei exposed them, their parents exposed them to Japanese culture at home. But when they went off to school, they were educated about America, right? They began to sort of live in both cultures and in two worlds. They felt stuck in between. So, for example, right, at home, they ate daikon, radish. sushi, right, and ume, pickled plum. But when they went off to lunch, right, at school, they ate ham and eggs, right? They ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. At home, they celebrated Japanese culture like Obon. But when they went to school, right, they wanted all the cool fads. They wanted the Mickey Mouse watches. They wanted to sort of be able to sort of assimilate into American society, watch American style cartoons at school, right? Oftentimes, the Issei and the Nisei, the first and second generation of Japanese people, were often called very demeaning names like Jap or Shorty, right? Many of the Nisei were stuck in these unskilled jobs despite getting higher education, but despite going to college, right? And so we start to really see this complex celebration of two cultures, a culture sort of being stuck in the middle, where we have the Nisei, right, learning about American ideals, democracy, freedom, Declaration of Independence at school, but also feeling that they have a loyalty to their Japanese culture at home. Gentlemen, we'll pause there. Again, this video will be uploaded onto Canvas. Make sure if you do not get through this video that you watch this video in full. When we get back next week, we'll talk a little bit about Japanese attitudes and how Japanese were viewed and perceived in World War II. I hope you have an amazing weekend.